In France. The case of Marguerite de Carouge provides documented evidence of wives being imprisoned by husbands. Following her husband Jean de Carouge's death in 1396, records show she had spent previous years confined to their castle under circumstances that contemporary sources described as most grievous imprisonment, though they provide few details about her physical conditions or treatment. She survived and eventually remarried after her husband's death, freed her from his control. But the years of confinement had damaged her health permanently. Her case was unusual, primarily because her family's status ensured it was recorded. Countless women of lower status disappeared into family prisons without leaving any documentary trace. The Holy Roman Empire's fragmented political structure meant individual nobles controlled their own justice systems with minimal oversight, creating conditions where arbitrary imprisonment flourished. The Castle of Cats in the Rhineland was documented as holding several prisoners in underground chambers during the 14th century, some for debt, others for political opposition to the local count. When the castle changed hands through conquest in 1371, the new lord discovered prisoners who had been confined for over a decade, their original crimes forgotten by everyone except themselves. Some were released, others were transferred to different prisons. A few simply disappeared from records, their fates unknown. The intersection of imprisonment and medieval gender politics reveals particularly disturbing patterns. Canon law technically protected married women from arbitrary treatment by their husbands, but enforcement depended on church courts that operated slowly, required witnesses willing to testify against powerful men, and could be ignored by nobles who controlled their own territories. The legal concept of custodia honesta, honorable custody, allowed husbands to confine wives to convents or castle chambers for supposed moral failings or mental instability, with no independent medical assessment required. Once confined, women had limited ability to appeal since their husband controlled access to their families, their property, and any outside communication. Several documented cases involved wives who challenged their husbands politically or refused to surrender control of their own inherited properties. Ella, Countess of Salisbury, 1187 to 1261, faced multiple attempts by male relatives to control her substantial estates after her husband's death. She eventually took religious vows and founded Laycock Abbey partly to protect herself from forced remarriage or imprisonment, demonstrating that powerful women understood the threat of confinement even when they had the resources to resist it. Less wealthy women who couldn't afford such strategic retreats often vanished without trace when they proved inconvenient to male relatives who wanted their property or freedom to remarry. The role of servants and guards in maintaining these underground prisons reveals the complicity required for the system to function. Someone had to bring food, remove waste, and occasionally check whether prisoners remained alive. This created a class of people who witnessed suffering daily, but were powerless or unwilling to intervene. Some guards were brutal, using their power over helpless prisoners to inflict additional abuse. Others were sympathetic, but trapped by their own positions. Reporting abuse meant losing employment or facing punishment themselves. A few guards accepted bribes to improve conditions or pass messages, creating a shadow economy around imprisonment, where prisoners with family connections could purchase small mercies that made survival possible. The eventual fate of prisoners held in these underground chambers varied widely. Some were released when political circumstances changed, their captor died. Their family negotiated their freedom, or whoever they had offended decided they were no longer threats. These survivors often emerged permanently damaged joint problems from years in cold dampness, Vision problems from prolonged darkness. Psychological trauma that manifested in what medieval sources called melancholia or acedia, what we would recognize as severe depression and post-traumatic stress. Many former prisoners entered monasteries or convents after release, seeking structured environments where their damaged psyches could find some stability. Others died in confinement from disease, malnutrition, or simple despair. Medieval chronicles occasionally note prisoners who died in custody without providing details, and archaeological excavations of castle dungeons have found skeletal remains showing signs of prolonged malnutrition and untreated injuries consistent with years of harsh imprisonment. Some prisoners chose suicide when the prospect of indefinite confinement became unbearable, hanging themselves from whatever fixtures existed in their cells. Or, in one documented case from Nuremberg in 1437, a prisoner who deliberately starved himself to death over 3 weeks, refusing all food in what the chronicler described as choosing his own hour rather than waiting for God's. The discovery and excavation of medieval prison chambers in the 19th and 20th centuries contributed to both historical understanding and romanticized myth-making. When archaeologists opened long-sealed underground chambers in castles across Europe, they found stone rooms that had been forgotten for centuries, sometimes containing skeletal remains and carved messages that testified to the suffering that occurred within. But Victorian and early 20th century investigators, influenced by Gothic literature and romantic notions of medieval barbarity, often interpreted what they found through sensationalized frameworks that exaggerated certain features while downplaying others. The restoration of medieval castles in the 19th century, particularly by French architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, created oubliettes based on his romantic understanding of medieval practice rather than strict archaeological evidence. His reconstruction of Château de Pierrefonds in the 1,860 seconds included dramatic vertical shafts that matched Gothic literary descriptions but had no clear medieval precedent in the original structure. These restored oubliettes became tourist attractions that shaped popular understanding of medieval imprisonment for generations, creating a feedback loop where the myth influenced how later discoveries were interpreted and presented to the public. Modern archaeological methods have allowed more careful analysis of genuine medieval prison chambers. Excavations at sites like Conisbrough Castle in England, Château Gaillard in France, and various Rhineland fortresses have documented the actual layout and conditions of underground detention facilities. These investigations reveal that while conditions were indeed harsh, the sensationalized image of the pure oubliette with only ceiling access and accumulated bones of previous victims is largely literary invention. The reality: long-term imprisonment in cold, dark, damp underground chambers with adequate access for guards, but designed to break prisoners psychologically, was disturbing enough without Gothic embellishment. The psychological mechanisms underlying medieval underground imprisonment resemble modern solitary confinement, which extensive research has shown causes severe psychological damage within weeks or months. Medieval prisoners subjected to years or decades of such conditions experienced trauma that destroyed their ability to function in normal society even if they were eventually released. The deliberate infliction of this suffering on people who often had committed no crime except political opposition or personal inconvenience to powerful figures reveals the casual cruelty of medieval power structures that treated human beings as disposable when they became obstacles to noble interests. The legacy of medieval underground imprisonment extends beyond specific architectural features into legal and social practices that normalized disappearance as a tool of power. The ability to make someone vanish without formal charges, trial, or execution created a zone of lawlessness where noble prerogative superseded all other considerations. Women, political rivals, inconvenient, relatives, and anyone else who threatened powerful interests could be removed from society through imprisonment that might last until death, with no external oversight or accountability. This system persisted in various forms well into the early modern period, gradually declining only as centralized state power reduced nobles' autonomous control over their own domains. The romantic myth of the oubliette that developed in the 19th century served partly to distance modern observers from medieval brutality by transforming real underground prisons into fantastic Gothic dungeons. Victorian culture could treat medieval imprisonment as something alien and extraordinary rather than recognizing the continuities between medieval and modern systems of incarceration and disappearance. The truth is that underground imprisonment was not exceptional medieval barbarity, but systematic application of power against the powerless, a pattern that has recurred throughout history whenever authorities have the ability to detain people indefinitely without accountability. The prisoners who died in medieval underground chambers left few traces beyond occasional skeletal remains and carved messages that archaeologists discover centuries later. Their names, their stories. Their final thoughts remain largely unknown, which was precisely what their imprisonment intended. But understanding the system that consumed them matters because it reveals how easily human beings can be erased when law and custom grant certain people absolute power over others. Subscribe to Medieval Survival Skills for more documented reality about how medieval power structures weaponized architecture, law, and isolation to destroy those who challenged authority or simply proved inconvenient to the powerful.